Hello and welcome to another teaching by 119 Ministries. Our ministry teaches that the whole Bible is true and is all still relevant to believers today. If you would like to learn more on what we believe and teach, please visit us at testeverything.net and examinalototo.net. We hope that you enjoy studying and testing the following teaching. Before you begin watching Part 2 of Sunburned, we sincerely ask that you have watched Part 1. In Part 1, we test Christmas and Easter to two things. Number 1, the Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 31 test. Are the origins of Christmas and Easter of cultic pagan sun god traditions, and thus an attempt to worship an unchanging Yahweh in a way that he hates, as the nations worship their gods? And number 2, the John 4:24 test. Are the days of Christmas and Easter worshiping God in ways that are truth or in ways that are false, as the Father only wants us worshiping in spirit and in truth? As you should recall, we discovered that the overwhelming evidence, citing factual historical references and peer-reviewed scholarly Christian resources, clearly proving that Christmas and Easter in no way passed the mentioned tests. We then found that the common and only Christian theologian defense for observing Christmas and Easter is that those days were Christianized, and thus we, as man, made something evil into something good, that we can worship God in our own way, despite what God asks for or instructs. We discovered that such thinking was the mind of Cain and spawned such events as the Israelites with the golden calf. Now we want to find out is, how did all these cultic pagan sun god days and traditions become part of the practices of the Christian faith? To answer that, we need to go back to the time of Nimrod. We can find the story of Nimrod in the Bible and the Babylonian legends. The ancient Babylonians began with the mother-child cult worship, which is still alive and well today. Nimrod of the Bible was the founder of this false religion. He is also known as Ninus in historical documentation. Scripture says that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The primary regions of his kingdom were Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen, which is between Nineveh and the great city of Calah. Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 9. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The fact that Nimrod was a mighty hunter does not necessarily only infer that Nimrod was a great gamesman. He was also a conqueror and hunter of men. Furthermore, the Hebrew preposition in verse 9 could and should be translated against Yahweh. Ninus strengthened the greatness of his acquired dominion by continued possession, having subdued, therefore, his neighbors, when, by an accession of forces, being still further strengthened, he went forth against other tribes, and every new victory paved the way for another. He subdued all the peoples of the east. Thus, Nimrod was most certainly feared in his day. The great city he built was Babel, later called Babylon. He also built Nineveh, which actually means the habitation of Ninus. Semiramis was married to Ninus, or Nimrod. After Ninus died, Semiramis continued the pagan worship he had inspired and declared that Ninus had become the sun god and was to be worshipped. She had an illegitimate son and named him Tammuz. To conceal her adultery, she claimed that Tammuz was supernaturally conceived in her by the rays of the sun, which she claimed was her dead, but now alive, husband Nimrod, who had become the sun god, and that Tammuz was actually the reincarnated Ninus. This Tammuz is the exact same one we see in Scripture, where women in the temple of Yahweh facing east and worshiping and weeping for Tammuz. Ezekiel chapter 8. Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of Yahweh, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Many churches worldwide often have the pews facing east toward the rising sun and worshiping on Sunday instead of the seventh-day Sabbath. These were all sun god worship practices that were injected into the Christian faith by a Constantine Trojan horse in the 4th century. But God's people have always had such problems well before the 4th century. How many know that there is nothing new under the sun? Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. God's people are fantastically good at making the same mistakes over and over again, each time believing that this is something new and something good. The pagan practices begun in ancient Babylon by Nimrod were also adopted and practiced by the Israelites. The celebration of the birthday of Tammuz customarily was observed at the winter solstice. Many ancient people believed that the sun was a god and that winter came every year because the sun god had become sick and weak. They celebrated the solstice because it meant that at last the sun god would begin to get well. Evergreen boughs reminded them of the green plants that they would grow again when the sun god was strong and summer would return. In ancient times, the winter solstice was celebrated in Babylon as the birth of Tammuz, the god of vegetation. This was the shortest day of the year, in the latter part of December. According to the pagans, the reincarnated god Nimrod would visit the evergreen tree and leave gifts upon it. This festival later became known as Saturnalia, and friends and family would exchange gifts. During the time of Nimrod and thereafter, many of the earth's inhabitants were sun worshippers because the course of their lives depended on the yearly round in the heavens. Feasts were held to aid its return from distant wanderings. Fraser admits that the largest pagan religious cult which fostered the celebration of December 25th as a holiday throughout the Roman and Greek worlds was the pagan sun worship, Mithraism. This winter festival was called the Nativity of the sun. Interestingly, the winter solstice was also celebrated centuries later by the followers of Mithras as the nativity or birthday of the unconquered sun. In Persia and afterward in Rome, Mithraism was renamed Babylonian mother-child worship. This is why Catholicism, which is a derivative of Constantine's sun god interest, focuses so much on Mary and baby Jesus, not because the Bible merits such focus, but because it helped turn the sun god worshipping pagans and those following the way of Yeshua to become this new religious sun-mixed hybrid. And even though Protestants rightfully took a step out of Catholicism, they still retain the mistake of leaving one foot in Constantine ways. It all started with Nimrod, and each culture over the years simply transliterated the sun god names into their own language. Just as Ninus or Nimrod was the sun god of the Babylonians, Mithras was the sun god of the Persian Empire, whose birthday, rebirth, was also celebrated at the winter solstice around December 25th. Worship of Mithras was widespread throughout the Roman Empire in the days of the early believers of the 1st century. Like the mother-child religions of the other cultures, which were copied and renamed from the Babylonian mother-child worship, Mithraism had its mother and child. Mithras was born of Anahita, an immaculate virgin mother once worshipped as a fertility goddess before the hierarchical Reformation. Anahita was said to have conceived from the Savior from the seed of Zarathustra, preserved in the waters of Lake Hammon in the Persian province of Sistan. Mithras' ascension to heaven was said to have occurred in 208 BC, 64 years after his birth. This birth took place in a cave or grotto, where the shepherds attended him and regaled him with gifts at the winter solstice. Payam Nabarez, Mithras and Mithraism. Mithras was not the only pagan deity said to be born at this time of year. Osiris, Horus, Hercules, Bacchus, Adonis, Jupiter, Tammuz, and other sun gods were supposedly born at this time of the winter solstice. In the south of Europe, in Egypt and in Persia, the sun god was worshipped with elaborate ceremonies at the season of the winter solstice, as a fitting time to pay tribute to the benign god of plenty. In Rome, Saturnalia reigned for a week. In northern lands, mid-December was a critical time because the days became shorter and the sun was weak and far away. Thus these ancient peoples held feasts at the same period that Christmas is now observed, and kept many of the same traditions. They built great bonfires in order to give the winter sun god strength and bring him back to life again. When it became apparent that the days were growing longer, there was great rejoicing because of the promise of lengthening days to follow. Thus, this central idea of the winter solstice, the return of the light, was adopted by the Christian world because of the themes of life and the birthday of the child. When the feast was celebrated in Rome, it was called the Festival of Saturn and lasted for 5 days. In both ancient Rome and more ancient Babylon, this festival was characterized by bouts of drunkenness, wild merrymaking, and orgies which would begin with an innocent kiss underneath the mistletoe and would then lead to justification of all sorts of sexual excesses, perversions, and abominations. The historical record is replete with testimonies confirming the pagan roots of December 25th celebration. All the customs and practices surrounding Christmas can be traced back to pagan celebrations of their sun gods. The religion of Mithraism in the Persian Empire, which featured the worship of mother and child, the child being Mithras, the sun god, was adopted by the Roman Empire as a dominant religion of the Romans. Mithraism remained in place until the 4th century of the Common Era, when it mysteriously disappeared about the same time that Christianity was declared by Constantine to be the new official religion of the Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine was a devout Mithrist, a worshiper of the sun god. During the time of his reign, his kingdom was divided religiously between the worshippers of the sun god Mithras and the worshippers of Yahweh, the one true God. Constantine cleverly realized that because of the many similarities, the two religions could be folded together. So, he declared to have seen a vision in the sky of a cross, and declared that he had become a Christian. He then decreed that Christianity was the new official religion of the Roman Empire, but nothing really changed. Mithraism merely got renamed. It came to be called Christianity, with Mary and Jesus as the mother and child. And the birthday of the sun god became the birthday of the Christ child. The adversary was brilliant. He created his sun god worship ages ago, knowing what worship traditions would result. Because it was similar to what Yahweh promised through his son, the adversary, or often called Satan, knew that such ways would then be adopted into the worshiping Yahweh. This makes the adversary smile because those ways came from him, and Yahweh declared that he hates being worshipped with sun god traditions. We have been duped, and our Creator appeals for us to come back to the only Word of God and leave the sun god ways behind. Constantine took all that was formerly sun god worship and he called it Christian. At the Council of Nicaea, he forced all believers in the Messiah to abandon all the scriptural worship practices, including the Sabbath observance, Pesach or Passover, Sukkot or tabernacles, and each of the other appointed times. He made it illegal to only eat clean, and he forced the eating of unclean things, such as pig. He changed all the customs and observed holy days to those times which the pagans had been observing for thousands of years to honor their sun gods. This is the very same thing that every Antichrist in history has also done. For example, we can read about the Maccabean period in which Antiochus Epiphanes did the exact same thing. Even Daniel mentions the changing of the appointed times and laws. Daniel 7, verse 25. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. That is what all Antichrists do, time and time again. However, Constantine accomplished something that no other person before him accomplished. After merging everything together like some strange religious sun god soup, he proceeded to continue to call himself and everyone else Christian. Many believers in the Messiah who were obeying the commandments and worshiping on Sabbath and keeping the appointed times, who refused to give up their walk of obedience to the Scriptures, were killed. In the 5th century, the Western Church ordered Messiah's birth to be celebrated forever on the day of the old Roman feast of the birth of the sun. In the interest of preserving their sun god ways and traditions, they simply changed the name and switched out the sun god with our Messiah. Does that sound like something God would do or Satan would do? Seriously, would God want his son to be celebrated on a sun god's birthday? Or would Satan love to watch God's people celebrate on that day that he made? Who do we want to follow? It was the celebration of the birth of the sun god in ancient Rome that was accompanied by profusion of lights and torches on the decorations of trees. To facilitate the acceptance of the Christian faith by the pagan masses, the Church of Rome found it expedient to make not only the day of the sun the weekly celebration of the Christ's resurrection, but also the birthday of the invincible sun god on December 25th, the annual celebration of Christ's birth. When the so-called Fathers of the Church in AD 440 decided upon a date to celebrate the event, they chose the day of the winter solstice, which was firmly fixed in the minds of the people and was already their most important festival. It was certainly quite convenient for Constantine to adopt this common custom of the birthday of the Messiah at the time he was trying to merge the world religions of Mithraism and Christianity. Why did the Roman Church fix upon December 25th as a day to honor the Messiah's birthday when it is clearly a pagan festival day? There's many opinions on this. The prevailing reason was that they justified the switch by insisting that the birthday of the sun was appropriate because they would still be celebrating the birthday of the Son of Righteousness. See Malachi chapter 4, verse 2. However, this flavor of thinking began happening well before it was all solidified into law. Others, with greater regard to good manners, it must be confessed, suppose that the sun is the God of the Christians, because it is a well-known fact that we pray toward the east, or because we make Sunday a day of festivity. Tertullian, 155 to 225 AD. Believe it or not, Tertullian has been called the father of Latin Christianity and the founder of Western theology. It should be a little disturbing that a supposed church father believed himself to basically be a sun god worshiper. Now you understand the type of thinking that caused us to be in such a theological mess. The end result, as it stands today, is a perverse adoption of the pagan practices of sun god worship into the Christian faith. Let's go back to Saturnalia. The pagan festival at Rome lasted several days, and loose reins were given on drunkenness and revelry. This was precisely the way in which the Babylonian midwinter festival was celebrated. But the Christian church not only adopted the 25th of the month to celebrate the Messiah's birthday, they also adopted the prevailing customs which the pagans had long been accustomed to during their festival. So they did not just adopt the day, but many of the traditions as well. Some attempt to defend Constantine's "if you can't beat them, then join them" approach to merging Christianity and Mithraism, citing that Constantine was truly converted and that he was a believer. Unfortunately, the prevailing evidence proves that Constantine was a cultic Mithra sun god worshiper till the end, while still also claiming Christianity. He played both sides of the fence. For example, Constantine continued to mint coins in honor of Sol Invictus, meaning the unconquerable sun, till at least 335 CE. We will admit, though, he was most certainly a good politician and had many fooled, and sadly, many are still fooled today. But biblically, we should not be fooled. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? 1 Corinthians 10. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. We cannot mix the things of God and the things of the adversary and just pretend it's okay. Before Constantine, for the longest time, until the sun god ways began to creep in, God's people kept the holidays mentioned in the Bible. In the spring, before there was Easter, there was Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. All we have to do is examine their writings. Don't believe it, that after the cross and before sun god influence, that believers still kept God's real holidays? Here's one example. At the end of the 2nd century, Victor, the Bishop of Rome, began to threaten other church leaders in an attempt to get them to abandon Passover completely in the favor of the Roman Easter celebration. Polycrates, the Bishop of Ephesus, wrote this to Victor sometime between 130 and 196 CE. Then there is Polycarp, both bishop and martyr at Smyrna, and Thracias from Emunia, both bishop and martyr, who rests at Smyrna. Why should I speak of Sagaris, bishop and martyr, who rests at Laodicea, of the blessed Papirius, moreover, and of Melito, the eunuch, who performed all his actions under the influence of the Holy Spirit, and lies at Sardis, awaiting the visitation from heaven, when he shall rise again from the dead. These all kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, in accordance with the gospel, without ever deviating from it, but keeping to the rule of faith. Moreover, I also, Polycrates, who am the least of you all, in accordance with the tradition of my relatives, some of whom I have succeeded, 7 of my relatives were bishops, and I am the 8th. And my relatives always observed the day when the people put away the leaven. Polycrates, Bishop of Ephesus. Supposedly, according to Christian scholars, based on the writings of Irenaeus, Polycarp was a disciple of John, the apostle himself. Yet, he kept Passover and Ephesus. Paul, though, knew it would not last, for he told Ephesus the following. Acts chapter 20. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. So from Polycarp to Polycrates, 8 generations of bishops all kept the Passover. If they kept the Passover, we can be rest assured that they kept God's other holidays as outlined in Leviticus 23 as well. That was, of course, until Rome made it illegal to follow God in Leviticus 23 and instituted their Christianized sun god days. Thus, the true biblical holidays were not abolished by our Messiah or by Paul. Those are all simply misunderstandings. For more information on that subject, consider watching our teaching series titled The Pauline Paradox. The Catholic Church readily admits that they are the ones, beginning with Constantine, that solidified through their law the abolishment of biblical holidays punishable by death. For example, it was the Catholic Church which made the law obliging us to keep Sunday holy. The Church made this law long after the Bible was written, hence said law is not in the Bible. The Catholic Church abolished not only the Sabbath, but all the other Jewish festivals. Also consider, since the 2nd century AD, there had been a divergence of opinion about the date for celebrating the Paschal Easter, anniversary of the Lord's Passion, death, burial, and resurrection. The most ancient practice appears to have been to observe the 14th, the Passover date, 15th, and the 16th day of the lunar month, regardless of the day of the Julian week. These dates might fall from year to year. The bishops of Rome, desirous of enhancing the observance of Sunday as a church festival, ruled that the annual celebration should always be held on the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday following the 14th day of the lunar month. This controversy lasted almost 2 centuries until the Emperor Constantine intervened in behalf of the Roman bishops and outlawed the other group. The problem is this. Despite all that occurred at the Reformation, there are still many traditions and doctrines that many hold on to that were simply the result of the unbiblical marriage between Christianity and Mithraism. Unfortunately, despite the thousands of Christian denominations that exist, there exists not one that has taken both feet out of the sun-God mixture that became known as the Roman Catholic Church. We would have historically done much better in the faith if we would just have simply considered and practiced the following. Ephesians chapter 5. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. We have no intent to offend, but the facts are clear, even from their very own writings. The Roman Catholic Church history is saturated with encouraging and successfully blending of sun-God religions contrary to Yahweh's instructions. There might not be a better example than the statue of Peter in Rome. Here is the famous statue of Peter in Rome. However, this statue was not always Peter. As crazy as it sounds, it was in fact originally the god of Jupiter. The statues of the gods from the Pantheon are now found in the Vatican Museum with the exception of the great statue of Jupiter, which has been modified, retitled, and seated on a throne in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome as St. Peter. The historical church, consistent with adopting sun-god ways and supposedly Christianizing them, has a sun-god statue that they knowingly simply renamed Peter. What is even worse is that thousands of pilgrims kiss the foot of Jupiter while thinking it is the statue of Peter. You can actually see how the bronze has worn away from so many thousands bowing down and kissing the god of Jupiter statue's feet. Typical of sun-god tradition, this statue in St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome also includes a solar disk above his head, and he's also showing a secret trident hand. Now watch how these symbols such as the hand gesture of a trident and a sun disk appear all over the works of the Catholic Church, directly from the influence of Babylon and pagan sun-god worship. The trident of Babylon was placed in the hands of all pagan gods, the pitchfork. On the head of infant Jesus, his Hebrew name Yeshua, there is a trident symbol. This pagan symbol is from Babylon, as we saw evidence in the god of Jupiter statue. Here is another trident gesture and sun-god disk. Again, and again, and again. More sun-god discs. Here we have a happy sun disk party. Yeshua at the Transfiguration with not only a sun disk, but the Tammuz symbol and the disk as well. More sun discs and a Tammuz sign. Again, and again, and again. Even sun discs on animals. Here we have the Pope and a sun disk burst, and Yeshua as the sun god. Sun discs are simply everywhere in the 4th century Christianity and beyond. The sun god disk was a prominent symbol in sun god worship, and because Christianity blended sun worship with the faith, it should be of no surprise that the artist simply changed the names, but not the sun symbolism. Nearly all false religions are grounded in sun worship. Here, the Hindu god Surya has a clear depiction of the sun god disk. Here, we find a pagan goddess of fertility in the Vatican. Here is the sun god Mithra with a sun disk. Some Irish monks here. More sun god discs. Here's an interesting ancient depiction of sun gods. Recognize the symbol right here? It should look familiar. Here is Pope Benedict holding what is called a monstrance. It is used to display a round wafer of bread called the host, which is used in what is called Mass, Lord's Supper, or communion meal. The Catholic believes that this wafer of bread turns into the actual body of Christ when consecrated during the Mass. With no sense of shame, the Roman Catholic Church even admits monstrance to be a sunburst. During the Baroque period, it took on a rayed form of sun monstrance with a circular window surrounded by silver or gold frame with rays. The Dictionary of Liturgy. The priest sometimes holds up the sunburst monstrance with the host inside for the congregation to adore and venerate. Virtually any time the monstrance is viewed by the congregation, they kneel in submission. A Catholic cannot walk past this sun symbol without acknowledging it by kneeling and or making the sign of the cross with their hands. Inside the glass enclosure is a crescent, upon which the round wafer God host is placed, called a lunette or a luna, which means moon. Note the similarity to the symbol of Baal, a cross within a circle. Even the world's largest pine cone sculpture is in the grounds of the Vatican. In Babylon, the pine cone described the fertility and regeneration power of Tammuz. The pine cone staff in Egypt was a symbol of the sun god Osiris. The Vatican, or St. Peter's Basilica, is truly an impressive building. It is the largest church in the world. Vatican means hill of divination, and basilica has its root meaning in the magical word basilisk. The solar wheel was another type of Baal worship. When Israel turned to Baal, they made chariots dedicated to the sun god, which they thought traveled across the sky in a great chariot. 2 Kings 23. And he took the horses that the kings of Judah had given to the sun, at the entering of the house of Yahweh, by the chamber of Nathan-Melech, the chamberlain, which was in the suburbs, and burned the chariots of the sun with fire. All through the Vatican, there are images and symbols of the sun wheel, but the biggest sun wheel in the world is right in St. Peter's Square. It is also known as the occult eight-wheel path of enlightenment by pagans or Wiccans today. St. Peter also faces due east. If you look at the center of the wheel, you see that there is an obelisk in the center, and at the center of the huge 8-point sun wheel is a smaller 4-pointed sun wheel, the same symbol as found on the altar stone in the temple of Baal in Hatzor. In Babylonian history, Nimrod was killed and his body was cut into pieces. His wife, Semiramis, collected all the parts except for one, his reproductive organ. Legend says that when the fish ate it, hence when Nimrod was reborn, he was part man and part fish, also known as Dagon. In Egyptian history, Nimrod was called Osiris, and the obelisk represents the male phallus of Osiris. When the Roman ancient empire fell, the Roman Catholic Church began to increase its power and influence until it gained total power, both spiritually and politically. Soon, the Vatican purchased one of Egypt's ancient obelisks. The obelisk from Egypt was brought to Rome in 37 AD. It came from Heliopolis, Egypt, where it had been built by Pharaoh Menkaure in 1835 BC in honor of the sun. It is also a sundial. Its shadows mark noon over the signs of the zodiac in the white marble discs in the paving of the square. The obelisk rests upon 4 couchant lions, each with 2 bodies whose tails intertwine, where they are placed in St. Peter's Basilica. Therefore, whenever the Pope holds audience to vast crowds within the basilica, the Pope is facing the obelisk. Perhaps Exodus 34 comes to mind. Instead of purchasing obelisks, Yahweh wants them destroyed. Exodus 34. But you shall destroy their altars, dash in pieces their pillars, obelisks, images, and cut down their Asherim, symbols of the goddess Asherah. The fish symbol has been used for millennia worldwide as a religious symbol associated with the pagan Great Mother goddess. Fish were originally worshipped as a symbol of Nimrod, because the fish survived Noah's flood, the sun god who after being killed was reborn in the womb of his wife Semiramis. Her womb represented the waters of the great deep. Nimrod then became the fish god, being reborn in these waters. Here you will see a drawing of the pagan goddess with the fish head of Dagon on her head, and another picture, this time with Isis crowned with a fish on her head. She was known as Isis incarnate, the great fish of the abyss. The old priest of Dagon wore a particular type of headdress, and the Catholic religion uses this exact same design on their papal headdress. According to Egyptian mythology, when the judges found Osiris, Nimrod, guilty of corrupting the religion of Adam and cut up his body, they threw the parts into the Nile. It was said that a fish ate one of these chunks, his reproductive organ, and became transformed. Later, Isis, or Semiramis, was fishing along the riverbank when she fished up a half-man, half-fish. This sea creature was Dagon, the reincarnated Nimrod. And Dagon is a representation of Nimrod of ancient Babylon resurrected out of the ocean depths as half-man, half-fish. Dagon is the diminutive of Dag and signifies fish. The Babylonians believed that a being, part man and part fish, emerged from the Erythraean Sea and appeared in Babylonia in the early days of its history. Representations of this fish god have been found among the sculptures of Nineveh. The Philistine Dagon was of a similar character. Manners and Customs of the Bible by James Freeman. In Babylon there was Oannes, a fish god who imparted great knowledge to the people. He taught them how to build cities. Zephaniah chapter 1. On that day I will punish those who worship Dagon. On that day, says Yahweh, a cry will be heard at the fish gate. I will punish those who are satisfied with themselves, who think, the Lord won't help us or punish us. The Lord's day of judging is coming soon. It is near and coming fast. The cry will be very sad on the day of the Lord. Even soldiers will cry. Now that we have a fairly introductory understanding of Babylonian history becoming part of the Christian faith, let's look at some of the sun god traditions that Christianity adopted as a result. Let's start with Santa Claus. The story begins in the northern regions of Europe, where the supreme god Odin, also known as Woden among the German tribes, reigned. He still lives among us as Wednesday, which is actually Woden's Day. Odin, or Woden, was the god of wisdom, magic, and the occult knowledge, runes, poetry, and war. His name means the inspired one. Like a shaman, he could travel in other worlds to gather more insight, while his two black ravens, Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, kept him informed about the news in the world. Odin was depicted as a tall, old man with a white beard and wearing a cloak. He rode the skies and the seas on his fast white horse with its 8 legs, while carrying his never-missing spear in his hand. He had one eye, for he had offered the other eye in exchange for gathering wisdom at the well of the head of Mimar, and with that he became a shapeshifter, able of seeing in the outward world with his normal eye and understanding the inward worlds with his black, removed eye. He was very beloved among his friends and followers who felt happy and energized in his surroundings. His enemies, however, he could paralyze or kill with his sight. Odin trained many men and women as warriors for the final battle against the forces of destruction in the underworld. His fearless warriors often painted their bodies black and fought in the middle of the night. Odin is a mythical representation of goodness with his wisdom, white beard, and white horse. His helpers are black ravens and black spiritual warriors. So now we have a wise, good man performing miracles with a white horse riding the skies, a white beard, a cloak, a spear, and black advisors or informers or helpers, and he is also the god of poetry. Next we go to the Roman Empire, where in December, the pagan Saturnalia was celebrated. Big feast with a lot of merrymaking, dancing, gambling, sensuality, and exchange of gifts. This festival was meant to celebrate the return of the sun on the shortest days of the year and to counteract the depression due to lack of sunlight. Time goes by. Christianity begins merging and blending with these religions. In the 4th century, in Myra, Turkey, a Christian bishop named Nicholas lived with a great reputation for goodness, benevolence, and performing miracles for the poor and unhappy. In this depiction of him, notice the sun god disc around his head and the trident symbol with his hand. This is the same exact disturbing hand gesture we saw earlier with the god of Jupiter statue, also with its own sun disk image. Legend has it that he miraculously supplied gold to 3 girls as marriage dowries so they did not have to become prostitutes, and he brought 3 children back to life who had been chopped up by a butcher. It is not difficult to understand that during the poverty of the Middle Ages, the bishop became extremely popular as St. Nicholas in all parts of Europe. His feast day, it was said to be his birthday, which was supposedly December 5th or 6th, no one really knows. There is no historical evidence, however, for the true existence of this saint. So now we see a benevolent, miracle-performing bishop with a white dress and a red cloak. After the Reformation, St. Nicholas became forgotten in all the Protestant countries of Europe, except for Holland. There he became Sinterklaas, a kind and wise old man with a white beard, white dress, and red cloak. He was riding the skies and roofs of the houses on his white horse, accompanied by his blackjacks. Sinterklaas will visit you on his birthday, December 5th and 6th, and donate gifts. His blackjacks have miraculously gathered information about your behavior during the last year. If you are good, you'll now be rewarded with presents. If you are bad, you'll be punished by the blackjacks, who will beat you with their rods, or even worse, put you in a big bag and take you to Spain, said to be the residence of Sinterklaas. On the other hand, if you do behave nice, you'll be rewarded with sweets and gifts accompanied by humoristic poems that will give you insight into your weaknesses. Here is actually some video depicting Sinterklaas.
Koentje, wat is er aan de hand? Ja, ze zijn hier. In the zitten, weet je? Sinterklaas.
Misschien moet Sinterklaas daar even zitten, of niet op de stoel.
Ja, dat kan ook.
Here the mix becomes clear between Odin, the good magician god, and the miracles of the benevolent Sinterklaas. They both ride a white horse in the skies, wear a white beard and a cloak and a spear. They both have black helpers. They try to support goodness and dispel evil through knowledge. And remember the poetry part? And then it is all blended with Roman influences, which shows itself in a December feast with gaiety and presents. In the 17th century, Dutchmen emigrated to Northern America and brought their traditions of Sinterklaas with it. In the New English-speaking world, the name changed to Santa Claus. In 1930, a designer for the Coca-Cola Company was asked to draw attractive advertisements because the drink did not sell well in wintertime. He had to use the company colors red and white and create some kind of cozy type. He remembered the Dutch Santa Claus, with his white dress, red cloak, long white beard, kindness, and benevolence. The 8-legged horse was replaced for 8 flying reindeer. A punishing blackjack was inappropriate for this concept, so he disappeared. The helpers became elves. So many do not know that the famous Santa Claus hat is actually the hat of Mithra. Much of the rest stayed the same. This new Santa Claus, or God of Odin, became a big hit. He became so popular that right now in Europe he is serious competition for the Santa Claus. Okay, on to the Christmas tree and the wreath. Wreaths are circular, and so in sun god tradition, they represent the female sexual organs. Wreaths are also associated with fertility and the circle of life. Wreaths are associated also with Ishtar, Semiramis, and also known as the Queen of Heaven. The counterpart male version of the wreath is actually the decorated Christmas tree. A Christmas tree decorated with spheres are to represent the complete phallic symbol of Nimrod. A sun god starburst at the top represents the sun god origins and is a tribute to the sun god deities. Various tree worship existed in Egypt and other sun god cultures. It was passed on to different nations, and the sun god traditions embedded in Germany eventually passed this tradition on to the United States. The name Easter. Worship was always associated with the worship of Baal, or sun worship. Astarte was Baal's wife. Another name for Astarte was Ashtaroth. Easter is nothing else than Astarte, one of the titles of Beltis, the Queen of Heaven. Now the Assyrian goddess, or Astarte, is identified by Semiramis by Athenagoras, also known as Semiramis as Queen of Babylon, later known as the name Astarte, for that simply means the woman that made the towers. Ashtoreth, then, is obviously the same as the Hebrew Ashtoreth. Notice this conclusive quote from Microsoft Encarta Multimedia Encyclopedia. Ishtar was the Great Mother, the goddess of fertility, and the Queen of Heaven. So in actuality, Ashtaroth, Ishtar, was Nimrod's harlotress, mother, wife, widow, Semiramis, as many other ancient historians attest. Easter is now established as none other than Ashtaroth of the Bible. We can now examine the scriptures to show how God views the worship of this pagan goddess, by any name. Judges chapter 2. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. 1 Samuel 7. Put away the strange gods and Ashtaroth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only. Then the children of Israel did put away Baalim and Ashtaroth, and served the Lord only. So perhaps you're familiar with the tradition of new Easter clothing. Where did that come from? Everyone knows that Easter is the day that everyone has to wear their new Easter clothing. This mentality stems from the pagan tradition that it is unlucky not to wear some sort of new clothing or personal adornment, because it symbolically signified the end of the old and the beginning of the new. Perhaps you've heard of hot cross buns. The history of the hot cross buns goes back to the Babylonian Queen of Heaven, Astarte, Ishtar, or Easter. And a reference to it is made in Jeremiah 7, which talks about making cakes to the Queen of Heaven. The Hebrew word for cakes is kavan, and is properly translated as buns. In Athens, about 1500 years before Christ, these buns, or sacred bread, were used in the worship of the goddess. They were called bon. Egyptian-made buns inscribed with 2 horns in the honor of the moon goddess, and the Greeks changed it to a cross, which fits the sign of Tammuz. The Anglo-Saxons made buns with a cross on them in honor of the goddess of light. Notice how in one of the pictures, they are included with eggs, another fertility symbol of sun god worshippers. Today, these same buns are made in respect to the sun goddess Easter, the Queen of Heaven. Carnival and Mardi Gras. In the traditional Christian calendar, it is a period of feasting and merrymaking immediately preceding Lent. Within Europe, traditions and customs are especially strong in rural areas, where magical rites carried over from pre-Christian times mingle comfortably with Christian ritual and precept. Carnival simply means doing without meat, and as a Christianized observance, is supposed to remind people of Christ's fasting in the wilderness for 40 days, the time of Lent. However, consider this article by the Houston Chronicle. Actually, there was a pagan festival in ancient Rome, one called Carne Levamen, which means taking away the flesh. Pagans believed the best way to give up flesh, or meat, was by filling up on it big time first, before the sundial brought on abstinence. In rural Europe, several of the main features that have endured in the carnival celebrations are, number 1, dramatizations symbolizing the death of winter and the resurrection of life in the spring. Number 2, customs and rites to ensure fertility and the abundance in man and nature. Number 3, rich food, drink, and merrymaking. The temporary suspension or inversion of social roles, rank, and superiority. Encyclopedia Americana. Shrove Tuesday is well known as Mardi Gras in the United States. The French word Mardi Gras actually means Fat Tuesday. This was the day that everyone gorged themselves on all their rich foods. They did this before the Lenten fasting. The sunrise service. This, too, was an aspect of old pagan customs associated with sun worship. Though the custom no longer directly and intentionally celebrates the rising of the sun among Christians, God does condemn the type of service from which it was derived. Many years after Christ's death, the Catholic Church began to associate the tradition with Christ's supposed early morning resurrection in an apparent effort to compromise with their new converts' previously held religious traditions. The Catholic Church's efforts to justify are clearly misguided, because when the ladies came to Christ's tomb early Sunday morning, he already wasn't there. The Jews, during the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, had blended sun worship with the worship of God, as we can clearly see in scriptural references in regard to the Queen of Heaven. Ezekiel chapter 8 talks about men standing with their backs to the temple of God, facing the east and worshiping the sun. Albert Pike once wrote that all pagan religions worship the sun. Whether they knew it or not, they were actually worshiping Satan, the adversary. The temple of Yahweh faced the east, so that when they worshiped God, they would be turning away from the rising sun in the east. The sunrise service actually stems from the pagan rite of spring that was held during the vernal equinox to welcome the coming sun. According to pagan tradition, when the sun would rise on Easter morning, it would dance in the heavens, so those who would congregate would dance in honor of the sun. The assembly of Sunday is a derivative of Sun God Day. Sun God worshippers were meeting on the day after the Sabbath for ages. Constantine made it so that Christians who assembled on Sunday instead of the Sabbath. For more on this, please see our teaching titled, The Sabbath Day. If you wish to know what day our Creator declared to be His and set apart versus the day that sun god worshippers declared to be theirs and set apart. Easter ham. The pig was sacred to the Greek goddess Demeter, the corn goddess, who represented fertility and abundance, and is another counterpart of Astarte. In various depictions of her, she is either shown carrying or being accompanied by a pig. So pigs were often sacrificed to her, and it was believed that by eating a pig, it represented and embodied their goddess. They were in fact eating of her body. The prophet Isaiah warned of this in Isaiah 65. Another source says that the pig represents the wild boar that killed Tammuz, and eating ham was done in remembrance of him. Also, the tradition of the Easter ham evolved from the English tradition of eating unclean to show their resentment and contempt for the Jewish custom of not eating pork. On to the Easter bunny. The Easter bunny is a pagan symbol of fertility and new life. Bede, the 8th century English monk and scholar, related that the Teutonic goddess of spring and fertility, Estré, had the hare as her symbol. The American Book of Days. To begin with, it is actually the hare and not the rabbit which is Easter's main character, because according to ancient tradition, the hare was a symbolic representation for the moon, since they only came out at night. Also, the Egyptian name for the hare was Un, which means open, because they are born with their eyes open, while rabbits are not. Legend has it that the hare never blinks or closes its eyes. To some pagan cultures, the moon was the open-eyed watcher of the skies. The hare is associated with the goddess Ishtar, and was a symbol of fertility because they reproduced so quickly. There's also a pagan tradition concerning a bird who wanted to be a rabbit, so the goddess Oestre turned the bird into a rabbit who could still lay eggs. Every spring, during the festival dedicated to Oestre, the rabbit laid beautiful colored eggs for the goddess. This tradition is exemplified in the Cadbury television commercial for the filled chocolate eggs. Another tradition, which has been passed down, comes from Germany. According to the legend, during a time of famine, a poor woman dyed some eggs and hid them in a nest as Easter presents for her children. When the children found the nest, a big rabbit leaped away, which led to the story that a rabbit brought the eggs. The Easter rabbit lays the eggs, for which reason they are hidden in a nest or in the garden. The rabbit is also a pagan symbol and has always been an emblem of fertility. Simrock Mythology, Catholic Encyclopedia. The image of a bunny is a very well-known ancient symbol of fertility, derived from the bare-breasted goddess Ishtar, or also known as Easter. This is why the bunny logo was chosen as a fitting symbol for an unfortunately popular U.S. organization. So what about Easter eggs? Eggs are a sacred symbol of rebirth and fertility among the Babylonians, Druids, Egyptians, and other pagan cultures. Dyed eggs were used as sacred offerings during the pagan Easter season and were also used as symbols of the goddess Ishtar in various cultures. Encyclopedia Britannica. During the rule of Caesar Augustus, Hyginus, an Egyptian who was a librarian at the Palatine Library in Rome, wrote, "An egg of the wondrous sight is said to have fallen from the heaven into the river Euphrates. The fishes rolled it to the bank, where the doves, having settled upon it and hatched it, out came Venus, who afterwards was called the Syrian goddess Astarte." Part of their worship to this goddess was the ritual involving the golden egg of Astarte. This is where we receive the tradition of the Easter egg. Now on to obelisks. An obelisk is a monolithic stone monument whose four sides, which generally carry inscriptions, gently taper into a pyramidion at the top. The ancient Egyptians usually erected them in pairs and associated them with the rays of the sun, which increase in width as they reach the earth. So popular were these monuments among the Roman emperors that 13 of them were taken to Rome. These monuments are centered around Baal worship and are traditionally representative of Nimrod's sex organ. Today, in Christianity, these monuments intentionally moved from Egypt to Rome, and then actually as steeples on tops of churches. Though many have done it anyway, Yahweh did not like the stone pillars that the sun god worshippers put up. Deuteronomy chapter 16. And you shall not set up a pillar which Yahweh your God hates. And finally, child sacrifice. This is one of the most disturbing practices of the sun god worship. This horrible practice associated with the worship of the fire sun god Nimrod, Saturn, Kronos, Molech, and Baal. Nimrod, as a representative of the devouring fire to which human victims, and especially children, were offered in sacrifice, was regarded as the great child devourer. He was, of course, the actual father of all the Babylonian gods, and therefore, in that character, he was afterwards universally regarded. As the representative of Molech or Baal, infants were the most acceptable offerings at his altar. We have ample and depressing evidence on this subject from the records of antiquity. The Phoenicians, says Eusebius, every year sacrificed their beloved and only begotten children to Kronos or Saturn. But why was human sacrifice such a key to the worship of this terrible god? What possible good could human beings think that they saw in slaughtering their own children? He who approached the fire would receive a light from divinity, and through divine fire, all the stains produced by generations could be purged away. Therefore, children were made to pass through the fire unto Molech. Jeremiah chapter 32. Sadly, there are legends that this is precisely why eggs are usually dyed only red in most cultures around the world. In the cultic pagan sun god temple worship, prostitution was clearly a common practice. This is why in the Bible that prostitution is often mentioned in context with other cultic temple practices, such as drinking blood, eating of meat sacrificed to idols, and other such practices of idolatry. Tradition has it that the priests would impregnate prostitutes in the spring, and then following spring they would sacrifice the children, and then burn them. The red eggs are a symbol of this fertility and the sacrifice of the children. This is expressly why Yahweh hates sun god traditions, because every tradition of a false god reminds him of the sacrificed children. He implores us not to worship him in their way, because it reminds him of the children offered to the fire. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 30 through 31. Take care that you not be ensnared to follow after them, after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? That I may also do the same. You shall not worship Yahweh your God in their way. For every abominable thing that Yahweh hates, they have done to their gods, for they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. When Yahweh sees a Christmas tree, he sees sacrificed children to sun gods. When Yahweh sees Easter eggs, he sees sacrificed children to sun gods. When Yahweh sees any tradition derived from sun gods, and then we do the same and offer it up to him in worship of him, he only sees every abominable thing that was done for the sun gods instead. But we do not have to celebrate the days of Christmas and Easter. we can leave all those traditions behind. As emotional as that might be for now, imagine how Yahweh feels about these days and where they came from. Fortunately, Yahweh has a much better solution: His feasts. By losing the sun god's saturated days of Christmas and Easter, Yahweh offers us His days, which are found in Leviticus 23. These are the real days that eternally represent the real Messiah, Yeshua. In the spring, we have the week-long appointed time of unleavened bread. During this time, we also have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where we can eat of the Passover, and we have first fruits, which is the real day on the real calendar that the Messiah was resurrected. Then a little later, we have Shavuot, also known as Pentecost. In the fall, we have the Day of Trumpets, known as Yom Teruah. 10 days later, we have the Day of Atonement, also known as Yom Kippur. And finally, we have the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as Sukkot. This feast lasts for 7 days and has a bonus 8th day added on at the end. Scholarly research has shown, based on biblical evidence around the revealed timing of the birth of John the Baptist, that we can calculate the timing of the birth of Yeshua. As it turns out, and it should be of no surprise, that Yeshua was actually born on one of God's appointed times, the Feast of Sukkot, and then circumcised on the 8th day of Sukkot, painting a glorious picture that only God Himself could take credit for. So if you really want to celebrate the birth of the Messiah, then read up on God's feast, His days that He gave to us to bless us. In fact, it is during the Feast of Sukkot that we're actually commanded to be joyful. Sometimes many find them confused, thinking that they are Jewish feasts, but our Creator, He calls them His feasts. Leviticus 23. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, "These are the appointed feasts of Yahweh, that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts." He gave us these days to draw us closer to Him and to each other in love and fellowship. The days also have real meaning embedded in them, to teach us about what our Messiah has done and still has left to do in matters of prophecy. Whereas Christmas and Easter are not from God, and any Christian symbolism is completely fabricated by man and is actually derived from sun god traditions. Once you begin participating in something that is real, something that is really worshiping Yahweh in spirit and in truth, you will then begin to experience something that has been intended for His people since the beginning, something we unfortunately lost because the influences Yahweh despises. We realize that this has been a long teaching, and we appreciate the time you've invested in considering this material. The reality is that there is so much more, but hopefully, at minimum, this pointed you in the right direction, fueling a desire to love God with all of your heart, soul, and mind on the path that He wants for all of us. We hope that this teaching has blessed you. And remember, continue to test everything. Shalom.